Hey, everybody, it's Steve Van Tassel. How's it going? We are in post-Super Bowl mode now, and it's time to talk about players you need to draft for your 2021 Dynasty Owner Startup Draft. And so we're going to talk about here second half breakout players. These are guys who did really well in the second half, later part of the season, and probably improved their draft stock, and who you're probably going to have to draft sooner than you would normally. Based on their full season performance because they did so well at the end of the year. And as we know, one of the things I've talked about all the time and I write about is that you need to check out past performance when drafting. So for example, in 2020, the top pick was Lamar Jackson, which isn't a surprise because of his age and his performance and his salary. But he also was the number one player in 2019. And second was Christian McCaffrey, who also was young and had a low contract, but was the second best player in 2019. But they had great performance through the whole season. But sometimes there's players who break out, who do better as the season moves along. Somebody like Kenyon Drake in 2019, who really improved after he got traded to Arizona from Miami, and really broke out in the 2019 playoffs, where he just was the value player of the week twice in both playoff games. So who are some of these guys who you're going to have to target earlier in 2021 because of their 2020 second half performance? Well, sometimes when we do these things, we have to look back. So the first thing I'm going to do is look back at 2019 and look back at a couple of guys, a trio of guys who were all about the same in 2019, but were drafted in a lot different spots in 2020 startup drafts. These guys are all young and very cheap dynasty owner players, low salaries. We got Steven Sims, Russell Gage, and Zach Pascal. And so first thing you notice when you see the article is that Sims and Gage were drafted much earlier than Pascal, about 50 draft spots sooner on average, which is interesting because out of the three of them, actually Pascal had the most points per game. He averaged 10.1 Dynasty Owner fantasy points per game in 2019 versus 8 points per game for Sims and 7 points per game for Russell Gage. But the difference is that Pascal had a good first half performance and kind of faded at the end of the second half. He averaged 13.8 Dynasty Owner fantasy points in the first half versus 7.4 in the second half. Whereas somebody like Sims and Gage, they really finished the season strong. Sims averaged 12 Dynasty Owner fantasy points per game in the second half and bumped that up to 20.9 in the final 3 games of the season. So he really kind of improved as the season went along, which helped his draft stock for 2020. Gage back in 2019, he averaged 10.3 Dynasty Owner fantasy points per game after the Falcons traded away Mohamed Sanu to the Patriots. We won't talk about how Mohamed Sanu did on the Patriots because that's a touchy subject. But his performance in the second half led him to be drafted higher. Both guys, both Sims and Gage, drafted higher than Pascal, even though Pascal had a better overall season. So who are some of these guys who, because of how they performed in the second half, might get drafted higher in 2021? Or in one case, the first case we'll talk about, be drafted, period. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at one player per position. Yes, we're going to look at kickers. I know some of you hate kickers. You can stop it at the end if you won't want to listen to the kicker part, but it's important. So we're going to talk about one from each position. And the first position we're going to talk about is obviously the most important one, quarterback. And the guy here who really had a second half breakout was Kirk Cousins. He was pretty consistent for 2019 and 2020. In 2019, he averaged 21.4 Dynasty Owner fantasy points per game. And then in the first half of 2020, he averaged 20 points per game. So it's no wonder that he kind of went undrafted in 2020 and nobody really picked him up in Dynasty Owner. I think he finished the season at 3% ownership. It's because, that production combined with the $33 million salary is not something you want to carry on your Dynasty Owner roster. You can carry it in a regular fantasy league or dynasty league because you don't have to worry about salary, but his salary means he just costs so much that he's just unownable basically in Dynasty Owner. And that's until the second half of the season. What happened in the second half of the season was that Cousins really improved his performance. He ended up averaging 30.3 dynasty owner fantasy points per game, and he finished the season, if you look at the whole NFL 16-game season over 17 weeks, he was the number 10 overall quarterback, which is very surprising considering how he started the season. I still think he's not going to be very highly drafted. Not a lot of people are going to draft him, but at $33 million, there's some quarterbacks who are going higher than him in terms of salary. Some of those higher paid quarterbacks like Jared Goff and Carson Wentz are questionable in terms of whether they're going to be the starter, definite starters, or be able to play the whole season. And so I think Cousins is somebody who people are going to look at and maybe have more favorable opinions of this year because of that second half performance. We shall see, but that's my opinion. That's what I think. Second position we're going to talk about is running back. And the guy here is somebody who had a pretty good season overall and was drafted pretty high in 2020, but I think it's going to be even drafted higher in 2021, and that's David Montgomery. Now, Montgomery was the 20th running back drafted overall in Dynasty Owner with an ADP of 44.2 in 2020. But I really think that's going to go higher in 2021. And that's because of his second half production combined with his salary, which is just over $1 million. And last year in Dynasty Owner, there were a lot of guys who you could get for about $1 million, a little over $1 million. You had your Dalvin Cooks, you had your Alvin Kamara, players like that. And those guys really performed and got big contracts. Kamara is going to be $15 million next year, and Cook's going to be $12.5 million next year. So they might not go as highly in draft base because of that salary. But one guy whose salary isn't changing is Montgomery, as far as we know right now. His is just going to be a little over $1 million. And he was drafted as the number 20 overall running back in 2020, even though he only averaged 10.8 dynasty on fantasy points per game in 2019. In 2020, if you look at the regular season, the Dynasty Owner regular season, the first 13 weeks of the season, he was the number 10 overall running back and number 14 in terms of Dynasty Owner fantasy points per game. He averaged 14.9. So that's pretty good for the guy you drafted in the 20th spot. But then the Dynasty Owner playoffs came, and he exceeded that. He averaged 23.5 Dynasty Owner fantasy points per game in the 3-game playoffs. And he ended the season with 6 consecutive games of 20 or more Dynasty Owner fantasy points. So, that's really good production at the end of the season. And I know part of it was because Tariq Cohen was out, and Cohen's going to be back, but this questions whether Cohen's going to be traded or not. But even if Cohen's around, I still think that Montgomery's going to be somebody you need to pay attention to and maybe draft earlier than you might think. It's because if you look at cost per point, which is a very important metric in Dynasty Owner, only one running back had a better cost per point than David Montgomery last year, and that was James Robinson. No surprise. So I think, Montgomery is going to was drafted last year in about the 4th round on average. I think he's going to go even higher this year. So if you want Montgomery, you're going to have to kind of think about taking him earlier. The third player we're going to talk about is another Minnesota Viking. It's wide receiver Justin Jefferson. 2020, he was the best rookie wide receiver. He finished the season overall as the number 7 wide receiver overall over the course of the season. He had 273.2 Dynasty Owner fantasy points. And this was despite a very slow start. He had 12 points in his first 2 games. And then week 3, he just exploded with 30.5 points. He was down in week 4 and 5, and then week 6 he had 39.6 Dynasty Owner fantasy points, and then he went back down a little bit. So his first half, the average was pretty good. It was 14.6 points per game, but he was wildly inconsistent. He was tough to decide when you could start him. Sometimes some weeks you got 30 plus points, and some weeks you got under 10. In fact, in 5 of the 8 games in the first half, he had under 10. But then the second half came, and especially after the Vikings had their bye in week 7. And over the second half of the season, he averaged 19.6 Dynasty Owner fantasy points per game. And not only that, he was consistent. 7 of those 8 games, he had over 10 points per game, 10 points. And in the 8th game, he had 9.9, so he was very close. So I think Jefferson is really going to be somebody who Dynasty owners are going to need to target earlier than last year and earlier than you would think this year, because in terms of wide receivers, young wide receivers who have low salaries and good production, he's pretty much the third one in line, I feel like, behind DK Metcalf and Ridley. Both DK Metcalf and Calvin Ridley, they were the only two wide receivers who had more Dynasty on fantasy points in 2020 and also have a lower salary than Jefferson. Jefferson's salary is around $3.5 million, whereas Metcalf's just a little over $1 million and Ridley's like $2.7 million. So right after those guys, you have to decide whether you're going to take a big high salary wide receiver or somebody like Jefferson. And, you wouldn't have thought this at the first half of the year, but Jefferson's second half really made him take off. The fourth guy here we're going to talk about is a tight end, and it's Logan Thomas of the Washington football team. Now, Thomas, not surprisingly, went undrafted in Dynasty Owner in 2020. Nobody took him in Dynasty Owner drafts. And then he had a season where he was the number 4 overall wide receiver, scored 10 or more points in 10 out of 16 games, and really was just very productive for you. But the funny part was that even though he was very productive for the whole season, he improved at the end of the year. In the regular season, in the first 13 weeks, he was the number 7 tight end, which is good, but then he was averaging 9.8 Dynasty Owner fantasy points per game. But then in the playoffs, in the 3-game Dynasty Owner playoffs, he upped that even higher to 14.9 points per game. And for Thomas, he was the number 4 wide receiver, and the 3 guys ahead of him, Travis Kelce, Darren Waller, and TJ Hawkinson, all make more than him. He makes only $3 million a year, which seems like a lot, but it makes him only the 25th highest paid tight end at this point. So barring a new contract for Thomas, he's still got 1 year left on his deal. He's going to be a very good value to have in 2021. And I feel that while he's not going to be I don't think he's going to be the top draft pick or anything. I don't think he's going to go ahead of the other 3 guys, but he's going to be somebody people are going to look for, and it's because of how he performed in the second half of the season. Finally, for those of you who don't like kickers, feel free. This is when you can turn off the video. But still like it, please. Still like the video, even though you don't like kickers. The 5th player we're going to talk about was actually the easiest one to write about. He was the most obvious one, and it's Tyler Bass, the kicker for the Buffalo Bills. Bass, the rookie, he was a rookie, and he only makes $704,000 a year. And for that, he attempted 93 kicks, which was the most in the NFL. But despite that, he really had a very, very, very slow first half of the season. In the first half, he only had 46 Dynasty Owner fantasy points, which is 5.8 points per game, which ranked him 26th amongst kickers. So near the bottom of the barrel kicker. But if you stuck with Bass, if you drafted Bass and you stuck with him, he was on fire in the second half. He only missed 2 kicks overall. He had 53 kicks in the second half of the season, and he averaged 9.8 Dynasty Owner fantasy points per game. And that vaulted him up to the number 7 overall kicker in Dynasty Owner after starting the first half of the season as number 26. And, I know people are saying, well, I don't want to take a kicker early. I'll just wait till the end and things. But the advantage of taking Tyler Bass early is that you get possibly one of the top 10 kickers for a little over $700,000. And in contrast, 2 kickers who are owned, Bass is owned in like almost 100% of leagues. But 2 kickers who are owned in like 75, 80% of leagues were Jake Elliott and Dan Bailey. And both of them make over $3 million a year. But the problem with both of those guys was that they scored less Dynasty Owner fantasy points overall for the whole season than Bass had in the second half alone. And so that's why if you're going to target a kicker, target Bass earlier than you would think. I've seen last year we saw kickers drafted in the 16th, 17th, 18th round at the beginning on average. And that's probably where you're going to need to get Bass. And I know a lot of people are going to scoff at this and say that's worthless. It's not a good idea. But if you can solidify a position that you have to start in Dynasty Owner for $700,000 and then take other players later on and have more salary cap room so you don't have to take a $3 million kicker who's going to give you very little production, I think that's a good idea. And that's why even though the people scoff at taking kickers, I would draft Bass and draft him pretty early in Dynasty Owner. So that's it. Those are the 5 players. So did I miss somebody? Who do you think is the guy who broke out in the second half who you should watch and you're targeting in your 2021 startup draft? Drop me a tweet, SteveET33 on Twitter, post it in the comments here after you like the video. Let me know. Tell me who you think I'm missing here on my thing. So this week's video was a little late. There was a lot of Super Bowl hype, and I couldn't get it out before then. But now post Super Bowl, we're ready to roll on the 2021 season. So starting to look at those startup drafts, figuring out who you're going to take, who you want, guys you're going to put in your queue and target. So these videos, and normally they'll come out on Friday. I know it's earlier in the next week, late for the first week. But please still like the video, read the article. It gives you a lot more detail than I can go into here. And like and follow the other Dynasty Owner videos. On Mondays, we've got Nate Christian, who does his prospect preview. Wednesdays, it's Matt the Jerk, who's going to look at salaries for each team. He's doing a salary deep dive into salaries and contracts for 2021 and beyond. On Thursday, Jay Pounds is talking to you about if you've got to rebuild your Dynasty Owner team from 2020, how you can do that. And I'll back on Fridays for guys to watch if you're in a startup for 2021. Make sure to follow the four of us on Twitter and Dynasty_owner as well on Twitter. Like the video. Thank you for watching. Thank you for reading. Thank you for being a Dynasty owner. Time to start the 2021 season. Have a good day. Bye.